Hey guys, today we've got another exciting game of Revised 40. This time it's going to be myself on the left piloting blue-white control, and my opponent Ryan on the right playing a blue-red deck. And for this game, it looks like Ryan's going to be on the play. He leads with a mountain and passes back to me. I go for an island and pass back to Ryan. Ryan tapping 3 mana for a Basalt Monolith. Basalt Monolith is one of the better mana artifacts in Revised. It can instantly tap for 3 mana, so it does get power synced. Power sync is a card that I have a lot of in my list, and they get significantly worse the more mana that Ryan has. So that's why I go for the power sync on Basalt Monolith. There's land number 7 from my side. And if I had a Serra Angel here, I almost certainly would go for it, especially if I had a copy of Counterspell in my hand. But it doesn't look like I have it, so I just have to pass back to Ryan. We'll see if Ryan draws his 5th land. And it looks like he does not, so he goes for a Lightning Bolt, targeting my face to avoid discarding to hand size. On my turn, I go for a Soul Ring, which of course taps for 2 mana. Still relevant even in this late stage of the game, since cards like Power Sync are pretty hungry for extra colorless mana. So Soul Ring can potentially still do some work here. Here I'm tapping, looks like 5 mana to cast a Brain Geyser for 3, targeting myself, leaving up that 1 island to potentially Power Sync anything Ryan might play. Power Sync nearly just as good as a counterspell here, since Ryan has missed a few land drops, so it's likely that when he does go to pay for a spell, he'll end up tapping out and not be able to pay for something like Power Sync. Ryan not looking like he found that 5th land, just going for another bolt straight to the face and passing back to me. Not looking good for Ryan's side. The blue-red deck really wants access to mana of some kind to deploy some larger threats. So the blue-white deck can try and capitalize on this lack of mana from Ryan's side by going for a Jayemdae Tome, hopefully going to draw some extra cards and still be able to leave up mana for Counterspell. Ryan goes for a Brain Geyser of his own for just 2 to try and find some additional lands. Now this is an interesting decision. Letting it resolve could mean that Ryan draws into lands and is able to cast his spells, but at the same time, countering it would just be wasting a counter. So I'm hoping that Ryan doesn't find anything of interest off of this Brain Geyser, and he doesn't find the 5th land. So really unlucky from Ryan's side there, having to discard to hand size, discarding an Earthquake and a Power Sync of his own. Ryan looking like he does find his 5th land there and goes for a Soul Ring. So end of turn, I draw a card off of the Jayemdae Tome and go for a Disenchant on the Soul Ring. Ryan's been kind of stuck on mana this whole game, so limiting his mana even further can certainly help to limit the amount of threats that Ryan can play. Still looking for a Serra Angel on the blue-white side of things. I just pass the turn back to Ryan. He finds his 6th land, which is an island. So he now has access to 6 total mana. It would have been 8 if I hadn't had the disenchant for that Soul Ring. But Ryan pays 6 into a Fireball for 5. I go for the Power Sync, since my hand is getting pretty cluttered with counterspells at this point, and I don't want to have to be discarding them. I still don't find the Serra Angel, and pass the turn back to Ryan, who finds a 7th land. We'll see if he goes for an even larger Fireball this time. And it looks like he does, going for a Fireball for 6 damage, which is met by yet another Power Sync. End of turn there, going for another Jayemdae Tome, still looking for a threat like a Serra Angel. And there's the first one. So Serra Angel can finally start to get in for damage, representing a 5-turn clock here since it is a 4/4. And Ryan goes for a Control Magic to take over the Serra Angel to his side of the board. This would be pretty bad for me. Serra Angel on the opponent's side would mean that I can't get in for damage, so I go for a Power Sync. And Ryan has a Power Sync of his own, but luckily it's only for 3 mana, which I can pay. So I pay for Ryan's Power Sync, my copy of Power Sync resolves, and Control Magic is countered. Untapping and going to my turn, I get in for 4 damage with the Serra Angel, which of course has Vigilance. putting Ryan at 16 and passing back to his side. Feeling pretty confident at this point, I can draw 2 cards a turn and have so many lands to cast things like Power Sink and Counterspell. And Ryan looks like goes for a Mahamoti Djinn, which is a really effective blocker for Serra Angel. And this one does resolve, so hopefully I have a Swords to Plowshares, or even better, my own copy of Control Magic. So I'm aiming to take over the Djinn there, and Ryan goes for an Unsummon to return it to his hand. I've got a Power Sink for this copy of Unsummon though, and I steal the Djinn to my side of the board. So just playing a land and going to combat for the control deck, attacking with the Serra Angel and Ryan's Mahamoti Djinn, putting Ryan down to just 3 life. No lightning bolts in my deck, but it does mean that Ryan will have to answer both of the threats, and that's enough to finish game 1. So Control takes down game 1 with Control Magic and Serra Angel. Moving into game number 2 here, with Ryan on the right side being on the play. Last game he got a little bit mana screwed, not having enough lands to cast his threats quickly enough, so hopefully it'll turn around for him this game. And it looks like it's going to, with both sides leading with an island into Sol Ring. Really powerful starts from both decks. Sol Ring is very good, both for casting Power Sinks and making sure that Power Sinks don't actually counter your spells. So Ryan goes for a Shatter on my Sol Ring. Ryan now on turn 3 having access to 5 mana. He uses that 5 for a copy of Earthquake. Earthquake is going to deal 4 damage to each of us, and he passes back to me. So now at this point in the game, the blue-white side is looking to find another Plains, and Ryan goes for a Drain Power. Drain Power is a really interesting card from Revised. It essentially forces your opponent to tap out, but not only tap out, but also give the mana that you have to your opponent to use for their spells. So if this resolves, Ryan will have access to the 5 mana from his side and the 5 mana from my side. So he is playing a deck with lots of fireballs in them, but I don't currently have enough to Power Sink this Drain Power. Using a Power Sink here would resolve and cause Ryan to tap even lower, but I decide to just see what he has, and it looks like it is a Fireball. Fireball getting in for a lot of damage here, putting me down to just 7 life. I do find my second Plains and pass it back to Ryan, so now hoping to draw into land number 7 and possibly a Serra Angel. Ryan going for that Basalt Monolith again, which can be used to dump additional colorless mana into things like Earthquake and Fireball. Ryan plays a Mountain for his turn, and thinks about his options, potentially a large Fireball in my future, but goes for a Lightning Bolt, putting me down to just 4 life. This is actually relevant here, since now a Fireball will only have to do 4, so Ryan's going to be much less vulnerable to things like Power Sink. And he does go for the Fireball, with plenty of mana to try and pay for a Power Sink. This Fireball would be lethal if it resolves, but luckily I have so much mana to try and pump into this Fireball that he's unable to pay for it all, and the Fireball is countered. On my turn, I go for a Jayemdae Tome, and pass it back to Ryan. Still hoping to avoid things like Fireball or Earthquake, since those would be very much lethal at this point. Ryan goes for another Fireball for 4 damage. And I go for a Power Sink. End of turn, I draw a card off the Jayemdae Tome and pass it back to Ryan. At the end of his turn, he untaps his Basalt Monolith so that he can use it for mana. Even if I did have a Serra Angel at this point, I wouldn't feel comfortable running it out since Ryan has access to so much mana, and he goes for a 3rd lethal Fireball. So hoping that this doesn't resolve, because this would kill me if it did resolve. So I think here with a full grip of 7 cards in hand. And for some reason, I decide to go for a Power Sink. This is actually a big mistake for me. I had plenty of copies of Counterspell in hand, which would have countered it, and I didn't consider that Ryan might have his own Power Sink in hand. So Ryan takes this one down. Moving into game number 3 after a big misplay by me on the left. I'm on the play this game, and I lead with an island and pass back to Ryan, who goes with a mountain as his first land. Looking like Ryan has plenty of mana this game, he decides to go for a Basalt Monolith. This will give him access to 7 mana on his 4th turn. Ryan doesn't have double blue yet, so he can't use the card Counterspell until he finds that second island, but does have plenty of mountains. And he goes for a second Basalt Monolith. This is actually pretty impactful for the control deck, since Power Sync relies pretty heavily on both players having a relatively even number of mana. So I go for a Disenchant on one of the Basalts. So Ryan tapping 7 mana here and playing a Fireball for 6, which I let resolve. Considering my options on the blue-white side, whether I leave up things like Counterspell or go for a big play. Ryan, at the end of his turn, lightning bolts me down to 11 and untaps his Basalt Monolith. So I go for a Serra Angel, not having any counterspells in hand. And it looks like Ryan has his copy of Power Sync ready to counter the Angel. So I'm forced to tap out of my lands, and I pass back to Ryan. Somewhat scary to not have any hard counterspells against a deck with plenty of mana. So Ryan on his turn going for that Mahmodi Djinn again, the 5/6 flyer for 6 mana. This is going to easily get in for a ton of damage, so I go for a Wrath of God to kill the Djinn. I didn't see a ton of creatures from Ryan's side the last 2 games, so using a Wrath of God to just handle one big threat seems okay here. Ryan now going for a Drain Power to try and steal some mana for something like a Fireball. I decide to use a Power Sync to try and preserve my life total a little bit. This might be a small misplay from Ryan's side. He goes for a Power Sync on my copy of Power Sync. The Drain Power doesn't actually take any of my mana though, since I did tap out to cast my own Counterspell. Ryan bolts me down to 8 and passes the turn. Now on my turn, I have a ton of mana to go for a Brain Geyser, hoping to draw an island and a Counterspell. Looks like I do find the island, and hoping that I can have access to a Counterspell for whatever Ryan might play. Ryan passes back to me, and I decide to use my extra mana to go for a Jayemdae Tome. This will let me sneak in some card advantage when I don't have spells to counter. And Ryan responds to my Jayemdae Tome with a Power Sync. Ryan knows that a Jayemdae Tome in the hands of a blue-white control player can get out of hand pretty quickly, so he doesn't want me to have that extra advantage. Ryan is tapped out except for that one mountain, so I decide to fire back with my own Power Sync. Ryan decides to Lightning Bolt in response, since otherwise he'd have to tap down from my copy of Power Sync, and I go to 5. Ryan on his turn, knowing that I'm tapped pretty low, goes for a Fireball, and thankfully I do have the Counterspell, so I do stay alive for at least a little bit longer. Ryan tapping out for a big Brain Geyser of his own, trying to look for more copies of Fireball or Disintegrate, so I decide to Power Sync this. Stopping Ryan from drawing cards can only help my life total, and since I do have an active Jayemdae Tome, I want to try and keep more cards in hand than Ryan. On my turn, I go for a Soul Ring, and use that Soul Ring to draw a card off of the Jayemdae Tome, looking for interaction or something like Serra Angel. Ryan on his turn goes for a second copy of Basalt Monolith, and then uses their mana to untap each other just to make sure they're working properly. So I go for a Disenchant on one of the Basalt Monoliths, still trying to limit Ryan's mana so that I can Power Sync his threats or take less damage off of things like Fireball. Ryan on his turn tapping a lot of lands for an Air Elemental. Air Elemental is a really big threat. It's a 4/4 flyer for 5. Thankfully, I do have the Swords to Plowshares to handle this particular threat. Ryan gains 4 life, putting him at 24. On my turn, I cast a Serra Angel, hoping to finally start getting in for some damage against Ryan. Ryan on his turn going for a Control Magic on Serra Angel. I have already used one of my Disenchants, so this Control Magic would steal Serra Angel pretty permanently, giving Ryan access to a 4/4 flying attacker that's very hard for me to deal with. After counting up my lands for a very long time, I just go for a counterspell. There's a small chance that Ryan could power sync or do something in response, so I just want a clean answer to control magic that won't lose me the game. After 2 hits from Sarah Angel, Ryan tapping 6 mana, going for a Fireball for 5, which would be lethal at this point. Thankfully, I do have quite a few cards in hand, so hopefully I have a counterspell for this particular Fireball. We've seen a lot of back and forth between Fireballs and Power Syncs this match, and there it is, there's that Power Sync. Ryan goes for an Unsummon on my Sarah Angel to save himself some damage before he has to tap all of his lands. At this point in the game, my cards in deck is getting pretty low, so I need to power sync this Unsummon in order to have a clock that can actually kill Ryan before I deck myself. So both power syncs resolve, Sarah Angel gets in for 4 damage, putting Ryan down to 12, and we'll see if I can actually deal enough damage before I draw myself out. Ryan goes for a Soul Ring on his turn, and passes back to me. And I draw what looks like the last card in my library. So I get in for 4 damage, and pass the turn back to Ryan. Ryan draws his card for the turn, gets a quick library count, plays his land for the turn, and passes it back to me. And that's the game. Really strong plays from Ryan here, despite a few misplays from both sides. Ryan takes this one down with a 2-1 record. Let's go over our most valuable cards for this matchup. First off, we've got Fireball, taking down Game 2 and dealing with things like Sarah Angel and other creature threats. From both sides of the table this time, we've got Power Sync, being able to counter spells and be basically extra copies of Counterspell. And from Ryan's side, we have Basalt Monolith. Basalt Monolith ensuring that my Power Syncs have trouble resolving, as well as dealing a ton more damage with Fireball. If you do want to see more videos like this, or see a deck tech for blue-white, be sure to check out the Revised 40 playlist. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.